In three, two. Hello, everyone. I am so excited about today's speaker and today's topic. You'll have to forgive us for being about 30 seconds past over the hour because, well, quite frankly, I just love Brandy, and we are such good friends, and we've been on the phone chit-chatting for the last 15 minutes when I looked up and was like, oh, wait. You're supposed to be doing this webinar right now. She is a frequent speaker on our webinar series, and quite frankly, she is like one of my favorite all-time, hands down, go-to experts in this industry because she has an unbelievable, she's like these young people won't know this, but like the encyclopedia of all things CA related when it comes to accounts receivable and billing and compliance and coding. And I have CPCO behind my name because of the efforts and love and energy she devoted in helping me get to the point where I could pass that crazy exam. For those of you who do not know Brandy, she began her journey in chiropractic back in 1999 in a small Colorado practice. It was during this time that she learned or found her passion to serve the chiropractic profession, but especially CAs. As she was growing within that practice. And eventually she became the office manager, and it grew to multiple clinics, if I remember correctly. She has worked with Dr. Evan William, my BFF, from Utah, when he was with ChiroCode. She's also worked with my very good friend, Kathy Mills Chang. So she has worked with the best of the best within this profession. So when I tell you that she really does truly know the answers to your coding, documentation, compliance questions, and really understands what it's like to sit behind the front desk to run a chiropractic office. It just doesn't get any better than that. And to boot, she's thoroughly entertaining, incredibly funny, and just like the nicest person on the planet. So anyway, I'm going to be quiet now. I'm going to turn it over to Brandy. Thank you so much for doing this webinar today, Brandy.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and for everyone who's joining us today to take your time away from your patients and on your lunch breaks to spend some time learning about wrangling accounts receivable. I know almost every time I do a webinar on collections and billing and coding related topics, I always say this is my favorite topic, and this one, again, is one of my favorite topics. I had such joy in working through accounts receivable for our offices and for other practices as I helped them in improving their collections and implementing good systems in place to improve the accounts receivable, maintain it once it is improved, and then showing offices how a fantastic diagnostic tool your AR report actually is and what you can really learn from it. So with the next several slides that we're going to be going through today, I'm going to be summarizing all of that for you with the overall goal of giving you a better glimpse into your accounts receivable, some good solid systems and strategies moving forward to improve it, and to help you find and fix maybe holes in your accounts receivable systems before they become really big gaping challenges that your practice is working through. If you happen to be one of those practices that think we've already arrived at the gaping challenges, what do? It's never too late to get started. We just want to start really with the fundamentals and go through the diagnostics of what you can do and what steps to take moving forward. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started with wrangling the accounts receivable. I do want to share with you, this is the picture on the front is actually one of my brothers. He was a professional bull rider. So when I got this topic, I thought, oh, I'm gonna grab his picture and share it. So that's my brother. But anyway, moving on, there's a few takeaways I have for you on this webinar that we're going to spend time going through today. One of them is to identify the inconsistencies and challenges in your practice area as it pertains to your accounts receivable. The next thing, of course, we're going to leave the webinar today with some solid action steps for you for improving your accounts receivable. Some of them are going to be those that you can meet with your team and implement over a period of time, but others are things that you can actually put to work right after you hang up from the line today from the webinar. I want to share with you also as we go through this process, keep in mind that the entire system that we're going through is really define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. And I love this system because it really establishes, first what we need to do is identify where our challenges are and then measure how significant they are to our practice, what we need to do about them. The analyze step is really, okay, what steps do we need to do? What do we need to execute in order to improve these findings? Improve is the actual action of doing that, and control is nothing more than maintain. And so anything that you ever do in your practice, I love implementing define, measure, analyze, improve, and control, because it really gives you a good, solid, manageable system to move forward with. So last but not least, you're going to be able to make a difference starting today with your accounts receivable and have a plan moving forward. One of the things I wanted to share with you is really how valuable your accounts receivable is. I share this in one of the early slides simply because I happened to be one of the CAs that had this initially as just, this is another task I need to do. It's a check I need to mark off by the end of every month or as quickly as I can to make sure that I'm reviewing the accounts receivable. But as I progressed through practice, and especially as we had multiple practices, I really became acutely aware of how valuable our AR is. And it's really, truly part of the heartbeat of the practice. And if we're not keeping a good grasp on that, we are not only losing a lot of money, but we're costing ourselves time and energy and creating strain that we really don't need to. So moving forward, as I had worked with practices on their accounts receivable, so often I would say, what's your goal, your overall objective moving forward with your accounts receivable? What do you want to accomplish? And so often we don't know which way to go. And so I love this line from the Alice in Wonderland that says, if you don't know where you're going, then any path will get you there. So with this webinar, we're going to help to identify that path for you and give you, again, some action steps moving forward. One of the things that I learned as I was putting this slideshow together is actually from a Princeton study, and it was specifically on accounts receivable. And I'm sharing it with you today, again, just to help set that foundation and build the value of accounts receivable. So feel free to read the slide as I summarize it for you, but they actually just say in that Princeton study that the management of your accounts receivable is so important because it is the collection of outstanding receivables which represents the very single most important source of cash for all organizations. So the Princeton study identifies right from the beginning, this is the single most important source of cash for your organization. And they also say that the delegation or the management of this is often delegated to a single individual within an organization. This, again, just to be clear, the single individual, especially for our practices, means a project manager, someone who's responsible for spearheading it, monitoring the statistics, knowing what steps need to be executed to ensure that accounts receivable is properly managed. What it doesn't imply is that there should be only one person who knows what to do. And with that, I'm going to share why in just a few slides down the way here. The next thing on with this Princeton study explains how your accounts receivable is an asset, and it's actually listed or reported on your balance sheet as a current asset. So it's expected to be turned into cash within as immediate as possible, but certainly within an annual business operating cycle. Many of your patients out there and many of your insurance companies have really old and aging accounts. Some may be within this cycle, others are extended beyond that. So again, this is a current asset that is actually money that your practice has earned, but isn't in your operating business account, allowing the business to thrive and use it. So we want to, again, make sure that we're addressing accounts receivable properly. Another important factor here is that the accounts receivable, like all of the different parts of your office, has many moving parts. And so as we go through the next several slides, I want you to be thinking about the many moving parts of accounts receivable in your practice and really how seamlessly they are working together. Just if you might envision just a set of gears that are all connected together in your practice, and every single one of them is somehow connected. And if there is debris or if there's sluggishness or something isn't working right in one of those gears, it's going to create extra work for others, or it's perhaps going to slow down the machine as a whole. So again, we're just honing in on the accounts receivable perspective of this today. But again, there's many moving parts to that, such as your electronic and paper claim submissions, your patient and your insurance payment posting, making sure you know how to properly read the EOBs and ERAs and post them accordingly. And by that, I don't ever mean just the bottom total line item, what was paid and what needs to be written off, but knowing how to review line item after line item to ensure that the processing was done properly, certainly with your patient balances as well, how you're collecting over the counter, have you implemented something like ChiroHealthUSA, would this be beneficial to your practice? All of these different things are moving parts to your accounts receivable. The next thing is how you're handling denied or rejected claims. your patient AR, is your over-the-counter collections system effective, and is it working the way that it should, or is there ending up being a lot of patient balances being offloaded to your billing department and ending up in patient statements that need to be collected? Collections prioritization, which is how you're going to address all of these different moving parts to your AR. Practice management software, and this piece really boils down to the training and how you're using the software. As with anything, the software is only going to be as good as the person or people are trained to use it. So that's something to be considering as well. And then what about your fees? Do you have appropriate and up-to-date fees? Do you even know where your fee schedule came from? All of these different things have a lot to do with your accounts receivable and how your cash flow and revenue works in your practice. I mentioned already that all of these things must work together. So just to quickly draw another analogy for you, no different than what you're sharing or you explain to your patients, that all the different parts of the body work together. The same thing applies exactly with all the different moving parts to your practice. In order to function optimally, all of these different parts need to be addressed. And of course, as always, it's more easy to maintain a system rather than fix or repair something that's broken. However, it's certainly possible. We just have to take the proactive steps forward to do that. So there are some things that cause your accounts receivable to grow. And again, as we go through these items here, just be thinking about your own accounts receivable, maybe make some notes on some areas you'd like to ask your staff about or your doctors about, or look into and discuss at a next team meeting. So patient balances, also, of course, can cause your accounts receivable to grow, and this includes your copays and coinsurances that are not collected at the time of service. Inefficient over-the-counter collection systems, so this could include patients that don't have insurance at all, but simply are walking out of your practice without paying their time of service fees. Deductibles and other patient responsibilities that aren't being collected at the time of service, including your non-covered products and supplies, your nutrition, pillows, that sort of thing. Inconsistent or non-existent patient invoicing, so do some considering how often you do patient invoicing. Do you have some patients with unusual account balances that need to be audited, but you know it's going to be time consuming, you haven't been able to find the time to do it, so it sits to the side for weeks or perhaps months before it's addressed? Are those kinds of things that you're having challenges with in your practice? There's also ineffective patient collection systems, which is endless patient billing. This is something I have a couple of slides to share with you as we move forward, but we're going to go through some patient billing systems and really what that costs your practice and some things that you can do if you happen to have the challenge of sending the same statements to the same patients month after month after month. The next thing is insurance balances. So this has a lot to do with your clean claims. Are your claims being submitted properly? Claims that are not regularly resubmit, traced, or followed up on that are accumulating in your accounts receivable because there's no attention given to them after the initial submission. And then low to no follow-up with your work comp and personal injury claims. And again, that's something that I'll share a little bit of information with you as we go forward, because those claims definitely take persistence on many occasions to get the collections moving forward. Fortunately, with your accounts receivable, there are some warning signs of AR challenges. And so there are some things that if you are watching out for it and you're watching your accounts receivable reports and your collection reports, you should be able to fairly easily identify that there is a problem with the AR that is either becoming a significant issue or is going to become a significant issue without attention. So what we're going to do is go through a couple of those things that, again, you can keep in mind and reflect upon your own staff's and accounts receivable reports. So let's suppose your patient visits are stable, but your accounts receivable dollar amounts, the totals in your accounts receivable 60 days, 90 days, 120 days moving forward continue to grow and increase. But again, there's patient visits remain the same, something isn't being collected. The next one is if you have a percentage of your overall accounts receivable that is greater than 120 days, or rather 120 days and greater is more than 25% of the total. That means you have just sort of a backloading of your accounts receivable as continues to just get older and older and older without any attention to those really aged dates in accounts receivable. If you have a significant amount of claims in your accounts receivable that's in the 60 days or more, your accounts receivable is probably needing some attention. And then also if your accounts receivable is greater, and this is your total accounts receivable, is greater than 1.5 times to 2 times your average monthly charges, The one statement I would make about that last bullet is if you happen to be in a practice that does a lot of personal injury, this is definitely a variable statistic because it may not exactly pertain, but this is, again, a general average, something to think about, that if your accounts receivable is more than 1.5 to 2 times your monthly collections or monthly charges. There's also some common invoicing mistakes that result in accounts receivable accumulation. One is no backup and a computer failure, and unfortunately it's happened before where you're not able to follow up on claims or provide records or information on claims simply because there's been a failure with the computer or the software, and you don't any longer have the information to be able to follow up with those dollar amounts. Therefore, they continue to sit in AR because there's nothing else that you're aware that can be done with them. The next thing here is having a single gatekeeper, and by that I mean only one person who knows what to do. This is super common in a lot of offices where there's one person managing the system and there's no one else. The doctors included are often left just with with no more than just hope and trust that this person really is managing things properly and knows what to do. The next thing is forgotten invoices, so patient billing and even insurance claims that can be overlooked, causing a loss of cash flow for your practice. This perhaps could be someone's claim was put on hold simply because you're waiting for new insurance or there's more information needed from the doctor. Whatever case that may be, these claims are sitting there and not ever getting billed out, which ultimately over time, of course, results in accumulating to your aged accounts receivable. The next thing here is inconsistent billing systems. This includes your systems for your invoicing your patients. Are you sending patient statements monthly or on a regular and scheduled basis? Or is it as you come upon a patient balance that needs to be billed, so you go ahead and print it as you stumble across it? There's also some systems for submitting your third-party claims. And again, this is making sure that your insurances are submitted on an organized and scheduled basis so that you have the opportunity to ensure you are submitting clean claims and that you are treating this process and this gear or wheel to your practice accordingly, because again, it's part of the heartbeat to your practice. There are some keys I want to share with you to accounts receivable management that will be beneficial as you start to put some notes and steps together for your practice. The first thing is really just a fundamental, don't procrastinate. Oftentimes, AR is not a favorite thing to do in many practices, and the effects of this is, of course, setting it to the side, hoping someone else will do it, or waiting until we have the time, which oftentimes doesn't come for weeks or months. So just don't procrastinate. Make sure that you are taking those proactive steps and spending even a little bit of time on a weekly basis going through accounts receivable. I am going to help you learn how to break this down to make it manageable for you, regardless of the busy schedule that you have. The next thing is have schedules. Being consistent is really important for making sure that your accounts receivable is given the attention that it needs. Of course, it's much easier, as you know, to maintain a system than it is to repair one. But again, if you happen to be one of those practices that feel like you're at the repair stage, never too late to start. The best time is right now. So let's talk about cleaning up the accounts receivable and really the first few steps that you're going to take in doing that. The first one is you're simply going to print and review your accounts receivable report. This is, like I mentioned earlier, a diagnostic tool to help you understand the how, where, and why your accounts receivable is out of balance. So you're just going to print and review it, and by doing that, you're going to be able to have some diagnosis at the end as to perhaps some of these areas where you are losing money through the cracks that is resulting in your accounts receivable accumulating, possibly some steps in place for staff training or for staff meetings. Other things is just cleaning up of systems. Perhaps you have a system that just simply isn't working, that it needs to be addressed and changed and improved. What you want to do next, once you have printed and reviewed your accounts receivable report, is what I love to do. I grab a yellow highlighter and I go through and highlight the total outstanding dollar amount in every column of the aging report, as well as the grand total combined in outstanding. Now, the aging report, to be clear, is I print 60 days moving forward. So 60 days, 90 days, 120 days and older. Anything under 60 days, I do consider to be current, even though, of course, as we know, Medicare should pay much quicker than that, and so should really every third-party payer out there. If your practice happens to have the time and the staff to be able to address those other accounts receivables that are not quite to the 60-day mark, but perhaps they're in the 30 to 45-day range, and you want to tackle that as well, by all means, implement that into your systems. I just have found that in resubmitting claims or calling on things that are just under the 60-day mark, I've had EOBs cross in the mail with my claims that I've sent, or I've been on the phone to call and check the status of claims when it comes in the mail the next day. So it's been costly to me in time. So in effort to be as effective as possible in the time that I have, I do like to work with just 60 days and older. But I highlight those outstanding dollar amounts and, again, the grand total, because this provides a lot of information for me or whoever is working on the accounts receivable. This is always information that's shared and reviewed with the doctor, because it's accountability and knowledge for them as well. Sometimes the claims that aren't being able to be cleaned up or to be followed up with is because we're waiting for doctor's notes and we're not able to take the next step until we have the information we needed. So this serves as a great deal of accountability and motivation in a number of different ways. The next thing you want to do once you've highlighted those areas in those columns is you really just evaluate the report. Again, like I mentioned, anything 0 to 30 days is considered current. Of course, Medicare has their 14-day processing rule, so you should have that by that point. If you don't, by all means, you're free to follow up with it if this is part of the system that you're implementing in place for your practice. 30 to 60 days, again, this is what I personally consider to be current. I don't start working it until it gets to the 60-day mark. That's purely for the purposes of maximizing the time that I have to work on accounts receivable. Again, if you are looking at this column, and if there's Medicare in this category, definitely should be investigated, but really so should most everything else. It's just you run the risk of something crossing in the mail or your ERAs electronically that are being pulled in. So moving forward, I'm going to share with you really the areas on the accounts receivable that I hone in on the most and really tackle as best as I can, as efficiently as I can. The 60 to 90-day column, any major medical, so your standard third-party insurance, needs to be followed up on. Follow-up procedures could be checking online, perhaps a phone call, or simply just resubmitting the claim if that is what's deemed to be the next best step based upon that claim and that third-party payer. Once you've been working through accounts receivable and even in just doing billing, you learn your payers pretty well, so you know typically the best step to take with them, or you learn it as you begin to go through the accounts receivable cleanup. At this stage, I follow up on work comp and personal injury claims. I always call the adjusters, even PI where there's an attorney involved that I know that we're waiting for a settlement. Touching base with that attorney has proven to me many times over to be extremely beneficial in keeping myself informed and the practice informed on what the status of that case is, and making sure we do get a settlement and we have the information that we need, so we're not sitting several months later waiting for payment when the other providers that are treating the patient have already been paid. So just being in the know has been really helpful. I think persistence is one of the greatest tools you could possibly have anytime you're working in accounts receivable. Of course, Medicare should not appear in this column, especially as the primary payer. So with Medicare, you're going to want to take those steps to follow up on those claims accordingly. The 90 to 120-day column, I treat it exactly the same as the 60 to 90-day column, and I take those follow-up processes with every single payer and every single claim that's outstanding there in order to determine what's going on with it. Of course, make solid notes of who I spoke to, where I got the information from, and any other information. If it's a claim I'm calling on, I always document the name of the person I spoke to, the date, the time, and if they say that the claim is being sent back to reprocessing, for example, I ask how long before I can expect to receive the remittance and make sure to log that down. So if this shows up in my AR the next month, I'm able to have all of the information I need to know what exactly should have happened with that claim. So taking good notes is going to be a fabulous tool for you. The next thing here also, the 120-day column. Nothing different or tricky about this system either, only that the older the claims get, the more difficult they become to collect. So taking good notes is really going to be useful to you, especially for those that you have to follow up with more than once. But I work through each one of those columns, and I am going to show you here in just a few minutes exactly how I do that. The best place that I have found to get started with this And my purpose for doing this, starting at the back, moving forward, is because those older claims are much more difficult to collect. So as long as you've probably heard the terms of having your money in motion, and everything that is surviving is in motion. Money's in motion, the person's body's in motion, air, water, everything is motion. So you want to get your accounts receivable back breathing again. So you want to have it in motion. I start with the oldest because those are the ones that have been sitting there the longest, that have the most challenges with them, and I start to get those in motion. I always work to address this in manageable pieces, which means for those practices that I have worked with that have really lengthy accounts receivables, that it's extremely overwhelming to print out however many pages and know where to start and what to do. I break it down, again, into manageable pieces. I start with 120 days, and if it means that this week I'm going to work through only the Blue Cross claims, and next week is just Cigna. I've broken it down by payer before. There's also been times that I have just gone by patient last name, and I've set a goal that this week I'm working through patient last names between A and G, and the next week is the next section of the alphabet, whatever that works for you, so you have a target to move towards so that you know you're constantly progressing. Otherwise, you really do find yourself in a situation where you feel like you just continue to spin your wheels. And especially with cleaning up accounts receivable, it is a few weeks before you start to see the results of it, and you don't want to end up with that deflated type feeling that you're working for nothing, because the exact opposite is really true. It's extremely rewarding once you start to see your accounts receivable percentages start to climb, when all of a sudden your collections for the month are up in the 90%, or those months that it's greater than 100%. When you're really getting that old money in, you just need to wait a bit for those rewards. With this, I would also say that if you find for your practice you'd rather start with that 60 to 90 days and flip the system I have, by no means is there a wrong system. The best way to do it is what works best for you, as long as you have a system in place. But definitely establishing targets to monitor your progress is helpful, especially as you're working through this. It can be sluggish and tiresome at times. But again, once you get this in motion, it becomes much easier. The accounts receivable report prints less pages month after month, and you start to feel yourself really working toward a more manageable and maintainable system. There are some general rules with accounts receivable collections. Again, as I mentioned, the older accounts receivable is far more difficult to collect, again, which is why I like to start with the back and move and start working forward. Your time of service patients, so those patients that do not have any insurance, there's not a third party involved, should not have balances. They should be paying for the services that are rendered to them and the products they purchase before they ever leave your practice. And then the next general rule of thumb here is just consistency is key. Believe it or not, those third-party payers out there do recognize consistency in billing or lack of consistency in billing. They can simply tell that by looking at dates of service, by looking at different fields on your claim form. They're very good and well-trained at watching for patterns in your claim forms that can identify possible challenges that you have in billing, not to mention clean coding and clean claims and all of that type of stuff. So making sure that you have a consistent billing system in place is also going to be a useful tool for you. There are some, importantly, again, as I'm going through, so much of what I'm sharing with you is what I have learned to be the best and most effective and efficient system for myself. I have helped a number of practices as well with this, but again, when you are working on determining what's going to be the best system for us, there is no wrong system as long as you have a consistent system. Something else to share with you is those over-the-counter collection systems often are one of those pieces of diagnostic information that are arrived at when reviewing accounts receivable reports. What I mean by that is as you go through your AR report, you start to realize the different areas where money could be slipping through the cracks, why it's not being collected. Some could be challenging payers. Some could be over-the-counter collections. Your copays and coinsurance is not being collected. Some is inappropriate write-offs. Some is not reading EOBs properly, so the wrong information is posted or the wrong write-off amounts and payment amounts, all of these different things. Over-the-counter collections tends to be a big one for a lot of offices. So I just wanted to share with you that what happens when we're collecting money over-the-counter, copays, coinsurances, deductibles, we need to make sure that we have the information at our fingertips to know that we know what we should collect from the patient. What happens if we aren't collecting over-the-counter collections as we should results, of course, in training our patients bad practices as they're coming into our practices and leaving. The next thing is, instead of collecting that $35 copay or whatever it might be, that balance gets entered into the system with the expectation that if the patient doesn't pay it the next time, it's just going to be sent out to them on an invoice. So really, you're weighing down your billing department and taking time from the billing department in their efforts now having to work toward patient collections and these balances that should have already been collected, instead of spending their time working through the details of the accounts receivable pieces as it pertains to appeals and insurance follow-up phone calls, resubmissions, and different things like that. So we want to make sure, again, that each of these moving parts to the accounts receivable is addressed accordingly, because it really does all connect. And what doesn't get collected at time of service really does become sort of like carrying an elephant for the back-end billing department. Sometimes it's even the same person, but they're creating extra work for themselves that really could very easily be avoided with implementing some very simple things, actually, for just improving over-the-counter collections. And that's certainly something we could go through at another webinar down the road. So there is a billing department cause and effect, and I'm sharing this with you for also just some motivation. Time spent invoicing in your practice does result in additional expense in materials, postage, waiting for the money. As you know, your money is more valuable now than it is down the road. So again, making sure you have those pieces in place to be as efficient as possible with collections is going to be extremely useful to your practice. It does result also in increased difficulty gaining traction with your accounts receivable management, as your billing department or the person who's responsible for working through the aged accounts receivable is working on those claims, but yet continues to have an influx of a lot of uncollected patient balances coming over the counter and landing in their plate, does make it challenging, and it is hard to catch up and keep up with accounts receivable with that. So over-the-counter collections is definitely an essential piece to this, and definitely is worth taking a look at for just about every office. With that, if you need help, definitely reach out. One of the things that I have learned, just because this is a highlight in a lot of accounts receivable reports and where we find that a lot of money is slipping, is simply that a lot of times at the front desk, the person there is not properly trained or doesn't have the information available. With that, oftentimes they find themselves not knowing what to do or what to collect. What does most of everyone do if they're not sure? Either take a guess, which you have a 50% chance of being wrong or right, which again is impactful one way or another to AR, or they do nothing at all, which means that patient is walking out of your office without paying those over-the-counter balances that they should be paying before they leave. So let's take a look now and spend a few minutes just going through your billing systems. You want to make sure that you're submitting clean claims, and this is again a topic that we could go through the claim form really piece by piece to show you exactly what to look for in ensuring that you have clean claims. But this again is an essential piece to your accounts receivable systems. You want to make sure that you take the time to work with this to make sure you're sending clean claims out and not resulting in increased denials and increased rejections, improper coding and improper fees and things of that nature. Also, for those of you that may be thinking, well, our clearinghouse actually does the scrubbing, I just want to take a quick moment to share with you that there are limitations to a clearinghouse. They're able to look to make sure that the claims have the proper fields completed, that the patient information is there, but they're not able to identify if the proper modifiers are in place, if you've used the correct code, if you have diagnosis that are adequately supporting your service. All of those things that you should be doing in your practice to find and fix the errors before your third-party payer does. So make sure you know those limitations and implement systems in your practice to submit clean claims before the insurance third-party payers find and fix them for you. So those doing data entry and billing, I do believe should have continued education on coding. What I love to recommend everyone to do is take a look at all of the codes you're currently using and read the complete description of those codes. This helps you to know what they actually mean and what they're for. The language used in those code descriptions is language that you can use in the documentation to make sure that you are clearly defining the services that you're billing for. And it helps in claim scrubbing from being a biller to knowing that this service code has been entered. These are the diagnoses that should be supporting it, or this doesn't make sense because I just saw this patient in our office and I didn't think that they did this. And so it helps to communicate with a provider. It helps to find and fix errors, and again, helps to make sure that your claims are being submitted as clean as possible. Most of the errors that you're going to find as you go through your accounts receivable are controllable errors. Well, let's go ahead and take a quick look at that list. One is exceeding the insurance limits, just simply not having an up-to-date verification, not knowing what those benefit limitations are, or if there happens to be a required authorization necessary that hasn't been obtained, is extremely costly to practices and results in accumulating accounts receivable. Using codes that aren't authorized by an insurance company, so making sure you know those insurance company guidelines, reviewing your Medicare LCDs, reviewing your Aetna chiropractic policy, Cigna, and so on to know what they do recommend or what they do require for specific practices and billing. The improper use of modifiers often results in multitudes of different kinds of delays and denials, leaving your practice in this situation of, can you appeal it? Do you have the documentation that supports it? Have you submit the proper codes for billing, or was there an error that now you're going to have to try to figure out how you're going to manage that? So making sure that you use proper modifiers is risk management for your practice in a number of ways. Insufficient diagnosis pointing. So as you know, your service codes say what you're doing, your diagnosis codes say why you're doing it. You have to adequately diagnose and point to the appropriate service codes in order to support your service. This is what it's like reading a novel for your documentation to your claim forms. And so your third-party payers are reading the claim form version of that novel, which tells what took place with this patient on this date in your practice. So your diagnosis codes very clearly define why these services are taking place or being rendered with a patient. This, again, risk management for denials, audits, and various things of that nature. There's also a controllable error of insurance having expired before the patient's visit, and this is communicating with our patients, oftentimes just putting appropriate signs in place in your practice. So when patients come in, perhaps it flips on the light bulb that, oh, we got a new insurance card last month, I should give it to you today. Making sure the front desk is trained to ask for this kind of information as the patient comes to check in. Not collecting copays, co-insurances, deductibles, and other time of service fees that the patient should be paying for. Chart notes often not available for a specific date of service, really truly leaving us in a situation we either can't submit a claim because we don't know what to bill, or practices are finding themselves guessing to submit a claim because they know the patient was there. But again, you're in a situation where oftentimes documentation and claim forms then don't tell the same story, which is a lot of vulnerability to a practice that should be avoided. Delivering care for a patient with insurance that you don't accept, but not knowing that until after the fact. This also impacts patient, provider, and practice relationships. So you also need to know your network details, your provider, payer policy details, patient policy details, verify those benefits. So many of these errors that are found, which can oftentimes be discovered as you go through accounts receivable, can be completely avoided with the proper systems in place in your practice. Let's take a couple of moments now to address the patient collections. This is just a quick motivational piece here that I read a study that said 12% of every healthcare dollar is spent on administrative services, which includes invoicing the patient. They say in this article that I was reviewing that $5 to $12 is spent per patient statement, which includes the postage, envelopes, staff time. So just imagine month after month after month spending the same patients, the same statements. After a period of time, you're not even making money anymore. You're just hoping to collect some reimbursement on what you've already spent just in effort to collect that $35 copay. So again, motivational piece here for you to make sure to address that part of your practice. Some tips for you here with collecting patient balances is just to be flexible but firm. You need to have the proper communication at the front desk and with the patients, and even in writing, so that you can communicate clearly to the patient. And this is a topic we could spend an entire 45 minutes to an hour just going over patient collections. But to give you a few tips in this particular webinar, you also need to know when to quit. I always recommend that the doctors or the owners, someone who's been given that authority, perhaps even an office manager, needs to be responsible for making the determination where patient balances are concerned. You don't want to find that the same patients have been getting the same statements for such a long time, and you don't have an endpoint where there's another decision that needs to be made. Is it to be written off? Are they to be filed with collections? What takes place next? Collection systems need to be clear. I, of course, always would recommend documenting them so the baton can be passed from one CA to the next, or assistants can come in to help if you have a larger office with multiple CAs, that everyone knows what to do and can step in and learn these systems without having to stop and conduct retraining for all of these different systems that really need to continue to move forward to protect the practice. I also recommend doctors to personally sign collection letters if you send them out. One of my actually it was a few of my offices sent collection letters, and I used to sign them myself. And although that was successful, I found it to be relatively minimally successful until I started showing those statements to the doctor along with the attached collection letter that explains to him where they were in collections, the amount due, and I asked the doctor to begin signing those. This was amazing for me in all of those offices because now all of a sudden the doctor is a greater level of authority. So now he's signing the letter to the patient. Also, he or she is aware of the balance that's outstanding by the patient, which oftentimes they're not because they're busy taking care of patients. So it again is accountability, having that knowledge, but it proved to be extremely useful and successful in our offices when collecting overdue or past due patient balances. For a patient collection system, a couple of the things that I will share with you that have worked really well with me is first and foremost is sending out regular patient statements. Whatever that is for your practice, of course, monthly is always best. If it doesn't work for your practice, perhaps you have a 60-day system, perhaps it's a 90-day system. I would never go longer than 90 days, but make sure you have a scheduled time to send out regular patient statements where you can truly print them out, sit down, review to make sure that they're correct, address those that are delinquent that need to have a next step taken place with them, and then get them sent out properly. Treat this task as valuable as it really is because this is part of that working capital of your practice that's not in your working business account. If you use notices of delinquency, which I always did, the ones that worked well for me was the bright sticker label, a notice that can be typed on the statement on the invoice, a separate letter, and sometimes a phone call. I didn't use all four of these methods at one time by any means, but for different practices and different systems, this is what worked well. Once the patient had arrived at the delinquent status, which for my practices, it was always after they had been sent 3 monthly regular statements. By the time it was 90 days old, it was considered delinquent. And at this point, the patient either got the sticker label, a new notice on the invoice that they received, or a separate letter. I liked the separate letter best simply because the doctor signed it and it worked better for me. But again, whatever works for you, just have something in place. And then these delinquent letters were sent over a period of 2 to 3 billing cycles. So for our offices, it was on a monthly basis. What you need to make sure that you do next is have that last step, what takes place. So I like to make a phone call or have someone in my office help to make phone calls as one last effort for your practice. Many practices don't like that. That's fine. Just make sure you implement what's best for you. But you do need to have some closure. There needs to be some type of final notice statement, letter, sticker, some type of communication that you use. With the final notice, you have a couple of choices. One of them is to refer the patient to a collection agency. If this is your step, you need to make sure you properly notify patients of that, and you cannot threaten it. This becomes some type of harassment I've learned through going through these collection and working with different collection agencies. So you can't threaten it. You have to follow through if you say you're going to send them to collections. Your next option is to simply write it off to bad debt. And then again, like I mentioned, consider calling as the final effort. If you decide to write off to bad debt, another recommendation I would give to you that has worked really well for me for a long time is having the doctor make that decision, or the practice owner make the decision as to what gets written off. I would never feel comfortable with a billing department or a front desk person deciding to write something off. In our offices, the statement was printed. The doctor knew that the final notice had already been sent, and he or she got to sign off on this goes to collections or this needs to be written off to bad debt, and that was put within the patient file. So no matter what, or no matter how much time had passed, we could always go back to see what decision had been made and that it was made by a proper party with that level of authority. I want to share with you quickly also, just in the last few slides we have here, is an example of a billing and collection system. This has been what has worked for me. I wanted to share it with you because it has worked well for me for a long time, and you can take the bits and pieces of this and plug it in to determine what's going to work best for you. Of course, you need to review that accounts receivable report. Make sure you have your patient statements on a systematic schedule, appeals and follow-up calls, claim submissions, and all of those different parts that go with accounts receivable follow-up, and they need to be on a routine schedule. You can break it up through the month. I always did, and I want to show you what I did on my calendar. I had a large calendar in the office. This is one that is simply for one clinic. I did other calendars when I had multiple offices. But the very beginning of the month, I printed the accounts receivable report. I never printed the current accounts receivable. My reports were always from the 60 days and beyond. This gave me the entire month to work through the accounts receivable as I needed it for that practice. Some practices didn't need that much time. Some actually needed more than that. And that's when I set targeted goals to begin to progress through and just get everything in motion. Once a week was the bill insurance day. Some practices like to do that every day. That's wonderful. You could definitely do that to get those claims submitted every day. Just make sure you have a system that allows you to take the time necessary to review your claims to make sure they're clean. If you find that you're submitting insurance in 2 or 3 minutes, just a quick batch and send electronically, print and stick them in envelopes and send them out, I can assure you you're most likely having errors on some of your claims that are going out simply because you're not reviewing them to ensure that they're clean. This is a lot of vulnerability to the practice that, again, could easily be avoided. My calendar also included some appeals and follow-up days and a patient statements days. These were scheduled for me on days and at times that I didn't have to be, that I could go into a separate office and avoid being interrupted for a period of time, because appeals and follow-up and reviewing patient statements, particularly if you're having to audit patient accounts, is a task that can be difficult to go back to and not lose your place if you're working through something that has some tedious detail with it. Certainly, if your patient statements can be easily and quickly done, then you can come and go from that, very easily. Again, schedule the time where it works the best for you. Just make sure you have it scheduled so it doesn't get missed by several days, weeks, or months. Some additional calendar tips I mentioned already: to have your own calendar just to monitor progress, provide accountability, and keep you on track. Make sure that you remind yourself that nothing is set in stone. If you have an inefficient schedule or an inefficient system, don't be afraid to change it. You can always go back. You can always make other mid-course corrections and alterations until you settle in on what really works well for you. Use your entire month if you need it to work the accounts receivable report. I've already mentioned some practices need longer than that, and they break it down either by patient last name, by payer, by aging column, whatever that works best for you. Again, I always go starting with the oldest aging column, and I either go by payer or by patient last name if I'm working through a really lengthy one. And I just work my way backward for as long as it takes, just making sure that on at least a weekly basis, I'm spending some time on that accounts receivable to keep everything in motion. I want to share with you a little bit about what's next, a couple of final tips that I have for you here. Time management is critically important. You want to make sure as you're determining your schedule to consider your available time and how much of it can be used productively when you're creating your schedule. So those things that are best left done when you can avoid being interrupted is best. If you find that that's not your office at all, there's no way you're not ever interrupted, this is when it becomes time to meet with a doctor, perhaps other people in the office, perhaps arranging your schedule in one way or another. You can always create the time if it's something that's important, which accounts receivable is really important for your offices, but make sure you create that time if you need to. Again, I read an article that just said that once you're distracted from something, it takes 8 minutes to re-engage, and that was super motivational for me to make sure those things that I shouldn't be interrupted from, I found a better time to do it so that I wasn't losing time for myself and for the office. When you're maintaining your accounts receivable, you'll find that consistency is key. Monitor by statistics. This is extremely diagnostic. You can watch for those collections to increase in the upper 90% and then over 100%. You can really see and that old money coming in. It's extremely rewarding. Doctors, if you happen to be those that aren't able to keep up with your treatment notes and you're falling behind with that, it's definitely affecting your accounts receivable and billing. So be accountable and get those notes done so that you can keep that motion, that piece of the motion in place. And then the staff, anyone who applies that does data entry collections, make sure that you do implement training. Review the codes and the code descriptions so you have a general idea of how they work and what they're for. You don't need to be the expert or have all of the information, but just having the appropriate tools and resources available, even if it's a trusted organization that you can reach out to with questions, is super valuable because this saves your practice a tremendous amount of time and money. As I close here, you want to move forward just maintaining. So this means setting targets, setting goal dates or goal dollar amounts for collections. My goals always were in getting through a portion of the alphabet, a certain number of payers, and then as accounts receivable became easier to clean up because the report was smaller and smaller month after month, it became increasing collections to 95% or higher or greater than 100% were goals as those accounts receivables were being worked thoroughly. You want to also avoid broken systems. So if something isn't working, be willing to change it. Meet with your team or other decision makers or other people who have roles that are impacted by this broken system to discuss what the next step needs to be. Make sure you have open lines of communication in your practice. Certainly make sure that you're holding yourself and others accountable. Oftentimes this is done as well by job descriptions and making sure that everyone really knows those tasks that they're responsible for. Implement regular training. There's no such thing as too much training, even for seasoned billers and front desk CAs. Being reminded of what you should be doing and knowing it's something you're already doing and doing well is a really nice feeling. So there's no such thing as too much training. Last but not least, if you have any questions, I am with the C Help Desk, and it is a virtual assistant that really does just answer questions as you have them. So I get a lot of questions on insurance denied for this, what's wrong with my coding, what's the new state rule for these various of things in my practice, all kinds of different questions. What are my Medicare fees? I get lots of questions of coding, collections, billing, and compliance to this. It's really, truly submit the ticket, ask the question, I respond to them. Most of the time, the responses need some type of reference, and so I pull the reference directly from the source, be it your state association, the Office of Inspector General, Medicare, your third-party payers, wherever that information comes from, that is sent to you as well, simply so now you know that you have that for your records, for your review, and for compliance, and you can just move forward. It saves a lot of time for your practices, your CAs, and the doctors. With the virtual assistant, I do also post the annual Medicare LCD, so you can click in there and grab your LCD. Annual fee analysis for every region in the country is posted so that you get your fee analysis as it pertains to fees per service in your specific region. There's also a clickety-split learning library, which is truly just a 5 to 15-minute short videos on common topics of common questions that I get in the C Help Desk, and I've recorded some tutorials for those. There's also a community chat forum as well, and it's ultimately just there to save time and money for the doctors and for the CAs. So with that, I have concluded my presentation, Christy, and will pass back to you.
Thank you so much, Brandy. We have a couple of questions. If you have an opportunity to visit the website for C Help Desk, I really encourage you to do so. I was so excited when Brandy shared this information with me, and in fact, I've already on a couple of calls where I was talking to clinics. They were looking for a consultant, but in reality, what they didn't need was a consultant. They just needed someone who could answer those questions, billing and coding questions for them fairly quickly. And I was able to refer them to C Help Desk, and they have had nothing but rave reviews about the service they receive, which doesn't surprise me in the slightest. So the first question that we have says, sometimes I feel guilty or stupid sending an old bill to a patient. What is a reasonable time frame to backbill a patient? I think this is something that many people feel in practice.
Yeah, so there's not actually an official rule on how far you should backbill a patient. Most practices, if the statements are within, and this is simply because a lot of times with hospitals, you may not get a bill from them for for 3 months to 6 months. So if you're backfilling a patient up to 6 months, then I feel personally that I have done that numerous times as well, especially when just getting started with sending patient statements out for practices. But sending them when they're 6 months old has been successful to me and not resulting in conflicting patient and practice relationships. Now, there are times that older ones need to be sent out simply because it's something that was just stumbled upon. There was some sort of billing error, somehow overlooked. There's all various of reasons, as you know, that these statements sometimes are really aged. If you start sending them out where they're 9 months, 10 months, a year old, my best recommendation is to send some type of notice to the patient. It doesn't have to be a long letter or long explanation, but just something that clarifies for them that there was some challenge with collecting from their insurance company. As a result, the information wasn't made available to the practice until recently. Give them some explanation as to why the collection or why this invoice is being sent to them late. Offer, of course, include information for them to call and discuss if they have questions. Most patients are fairly responsive and understanding to that. Those that are not are probably ones that were not going to pay the invoice anyway when you sent it, even if it had been earlier, and you'll be finding yourself, putting them through some sort of collection system that we talked about.
Great. Our next question is, how often do you recommend following up with workers' comp or PI claims that may take a couple of years to settle?
Initially, I really like calling on work comp and PI on at least once per month until I know that it's likely going to take a couple of years or it could be several months out. On those that I have learned that it's going to be a good period of time, I set a tickler in my files to call either 60 days or every 90 days. And I've done both with different practices based upon whatever system we put in place, but at least following up once every quarter is going to at least keep your fingers on the pulse of that so you have the most current information on a regular basis. And it helps to get settlements to not have to worry if something had settled and you missed out, those various of things. But at least once per quarter, but every 60 days is great as well, just to follow up and make sure that all of the information that you believed to be true is still current and moving forward.
All right. Well, that looks like all the questions. If you have any more, please go ahead and submit those now. Just a reminder, next week we pick up March and we have Baron Hoig talking about the chiropractic story. This is one of my favorite webinars that we do every single year. The following week, we're going to be talking about technology and chiropractic with Dr. Jay Greenstein. And of course, we always have to touch on compliance at some point during the month. So we are going to be having Dr. Ty Talcott talking to us about new updates and compliance challenges for 2019. And for all of those practices out there who might be considering multidisciplinary practice, we have Dr. Mark Santa with Breakthrough Coaching who will be on. Now, all of the webinars are posted through March and April. Be sure to check it out every single week where we will be updating the webinars on a daily basis because we have so many great people coming on board to do webinars. Okay, one last question before we wrap it up. It said, are electronic statements becoming more popular?
They are, and there's a couple of challenges with the electronic statements. One is they do go directed to patients' email addresses, which oftentimes either end up as spam, they go unchecked, or they get so much in the email that it all gets deleted. If that's a direction that your practice decides to move in with electronic statements, be aware that you could potentially have some new challenges with collections simply because the electronic age of communication. And one of the methods for that to help patients know what to watch for as far as statements is let them either choose if they prefer their statements being sent electronically or by paper, or have a very clear notice in your financial policy that patient statements are sent electronically. And of course, having follow-up procedures like we talked about throughout this webinar will help you to avoid that accumulated accounts receivable simply because your statements are being deleted in someone's inbox.
And I have to say, on a personal note, I love getting mine in my inbox because, especially if they provide a payment link, and again, this is personal preference, if it provides a payment link where I can go on there and pay that immediately as soon as I get notified, my son's pediatrician, my daughter's pediatrician, their general practitioner, my husband's general practitioner. They all do that, and it comes to my email address as soon as it pops in. I click on the link, pay the balance, save the receipt into my little tax folder. Um, so I love that, and I think more and more people are so used to being able to do everything electronically. So, but I agree that there's definitely some things you need to consider before going that route, like Brandy mentioned. That is all we have time for today, ladies and gentlemen. So I hope you have an amazing rest of your day and a fabulous week, and we look forward to having you join us next week with Baron Hoig. Bye-bye, everyone. Hey, Brandy.